Has tipping culture gotten out of hand in America? That's what I want to talk to you about today. We recently had a poll that I put up on Instagram where 74% said that they did agree that tipping culture has gotten out of hand here in America. Many people seem to feel that the amount of tips that we're giving to workers is getting excessive. And I want to discuss whether or not that's a fair take, or maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. And joining me today to have this discussion is PoliticN Lyn, who is a political content creator on Instagram and TikTok. Lyn, thanks for being on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I kind of want to give a little bit of a background here before we kind of get into it. Like tipping has obviously been a part of our culture for forever, as far as I'm concerned. And there's a lot of like historical roots to it, but in more like modern history, in the 1950s, it was pretty common for, people to give like a 10% tip when they were out at like a service industry, like a restaurant, bar, what have you. That rose to about 15% in the 1980s. And currently it's around 20-25% here in America. Now they are saying that, restaurants and coffee shops particularly are seeing overall about 17% more tips being reported in the last couple of years than they were in previous times. But many experts are claiming that what we're currently seeing is rather what they refer to as tipflation, which I think is a weird name, but where they're saying that customers are being asked to tip on damn near everything, even products that don't really require a service, to which I kind of agree in a weird way, but I'm going to get into that here in a minute. But I want to start off with your thoughts on this one. Do you think that there are too many businesses, too many industries asking for tips? Has tipping gotten out of control in America?
I mean, I let me just preface this by saying that I'm a tipper. Okay. I
Yeah,
love to feel good, but I love to feel good about the service that's being rendered so that I feel good about paying this additional money. But at the
right.
end of the day, I don't necessarily think it's getting out of control. I just think that we're having the wrong conversation. A lot of us are talking from the patron standpoint, and then you have everyone else that is in the service industry from that standpoint. And we're having the conversation with each other, but really we need to be having the conversation with the owners of these companies, because like you said, in the 50s, pretty much the standard practice was 10%. It's gone all the way up to 20%. Some places, they'll recommend 30. And that's based on what you're purchasing at a lot of places. If you're at a bar or a restaurant, it's 20% of your actual purchase. Now, I have seen, just as a one-off, I have seen kiosks where there's absolutely no person that's
Yeah.
present at the time asking for a tip, and that's ridiculous. And I think that's always going to get, a perplexed response from a patron, because they're like, "Well, I went over here, I picked this up myself, I came over to a kiosk, and you're like, hey, do you want to tip me?" And it's like, who am I tipping? And I think what it is, what in my perspective is, it's a predatory thing that the owners of a lot of these companies do. And I know some people would disagree, but it's the reason that the server needs that so much is because they're not getting paid appropriately. And the reason that the patron is feeling so squeezed is because they're like, wow, 20% or 30%, every single time on, whatever the service might be, is a lot on me. And some people, and the server will say, hey, don't come out if you can't tip. But then they're not patronizing the business. So, like I
Right.
said, that conversation can go round and round in a circle. But really, the nucleus of that conversation is, how come you're not paying your employees enough so that they
True.
don't need a tip, right? So that if I give them a tip, then it's helping them. And it's not helping them, it's helping them in addition to, and not to survive. And specifically with the service industry, such as bars and restaurants, it's a little bit different than other service industries that you tip, right? If you go and you go to a sky cap and they're helping you with your bags, you tip them, no problem. That tip goes directly to them. But in reality, when you're dealing with restaurants and bars, the patron oftentimes thinks like, hey, if I give you this $20 tip, it's going directly to you. And it's actually not going directly to them, because they have different types of tipping models that give out those tips to the individuals that are working, whether it be the bus boys or the bartenders. And what the point I'm really trying to make about that is that the owners at times get to take all the spoils. from the services that are being rendered in their establishment, right? Because when you go somewhere and you really like being there, you like being there because the server's giving you good service. You like being there because your drinks came out right and on time. And you like being there because it's a clean establishment and people are making sure it's clean. And none of those things have anything to do with the owner. But the owner is going to get all the spoils of what's being rendered to make their establishment successful. And I just think that sometimes that's the conversation we're not actually having.
No, it's a fair conversation. And I also want to preface how I feel about all of this with I used to work for tips
Yeah.
for about 7 years. I was a delivery driver for I worked at a Jimmy John's, I worked at a Pizza Hut, I worked at another like pizza shop or in the town that I live in. And it is something that I had to rely on. Like, because obviously jobs like that don't pay you enough. I'm going to get into that here in a moment.
Right, right.
But it was something that I felt, like I kind of like needed. I needed to have certain numbers of tips just to be able to survive,
Right.
because those jobs again just don't pay you enough. But strangely enough, even though I was a person who worked for tips and lived off them, there is a part of me that does understand why people are upset. So like when I first like posted this the response to that poll on Instagram, I said, like on the story that like I was firmly with the 26% who thought that tipping culture hadn't gotten out of hand. And I promise I'm gonna get to that in a minute. But I do understand why some people would feel like it has. Like when you're in any like business anymore, sometimes it seems like everyone has one of those square readers, and no matter
Mhm.
what it is, they flip it around, and then they basically it asks you to give a tip. And maybe you have like a bunch of people behind you and you might feel guilty if you don't leave a tip, or maybe you're on a date and you might feel guilty for not leaving a tip. But there are some things where it just doesn't make sense to leave a tip. There are certain cases where it just didn't make sense. I think there are plenty of cases where it does, but there are some where it doesn't. And I do think it's not really a black or white conversation. I do want to say though, like you were saying with the kiosk thing, there those things absolutely drive me crazy. First and foremost, an
Yeah.
automated service like that should never be asking for tips. Let me just put that out there. I gave a donation to a politician one time on like Act Blue, and Act Blue asked me for a tip, and I was like, "What are we doing here? Like, what
Yeah.
what are we doing? You can't be asking me for a tip. Like, come on now." But to the point about about wages, so one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is the tipped minimum wage, in America.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
was it was established in 1991, and when it was established, it was set to $2.13. Now in 2023, it is still at $2.13. And in fact, not only that, there are the only states in America who have their tipped minimum wage the same as their actual minimum wage are Alaska, California, Minnesota, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. That's it. Every other state has a different tipped minimum wage versus their
Right.
actual minimum wage. And we already know the minimum wage ain't shit. And so now you're
Right.
asking people to have an even less of a wage. And you're basically asking these people in the remaining 40 plus states they have to have these tips in order to survive
Right.
in a country where we're seeing a rise of inflation everywhere. People are seeing their wages like, year over year be, it shrank by all these like greedy, like corporate
Right.
entities just like increasing products, the value of product just over and over again unnecessarily. So the thing I wanted to ask you specifically here is, do you think that we have a problem in our country where too many people are trying to blame the service industry workers and not putting enough blame on companies who just really aren't paying people enough? And why do you think people don't seem to see that?
I mean, yes, absolutely. Everything, in a capitalistic society, you always have to stop for a moment, when we're at the lower level of the capitalism ladder, and we have to say to each other, are we having the right conversation? Because at the end of the day, what makes these establishments that have the minimum tipping wage, what makes you different than any other company that has to at least meet the minimum wage before we even start talking about anything else, right? What makes you different? And you could look this up for yourself, and I don't want to necessarily tie it into into race, but during Reconstruction in this country specifically, when a lot of Black newly freed slaves were trying to find jobs and work at these establishments, that is a part of where that came from. They were saying, you could work here. I need you to serve, right? We're used to you being of service and not paying you. So we're not going to keep not paying you, and you can work for tips. And then we get to the point now we're all the way a century later, and we're looking at that same industry and we're saying, this isn't a slave wage. This isn't something that is just completely preposterous when it comes to any other industry in the entire nation. We just allow them to, I mean, we've already stagnated, minimum wage, but just think about having a $2.13 per hour tip. And I mean, per hour wage. And the thing is about that is that if you talk to a server, they can come out with a $0 check,
Yeah.
depending on the tipping structure that they have at the particular place. And so that's why I'm saying you have the patrons that are like, oh, well, you just want this money from me. And, you get into these arguments and you see these things online all the time of these people getting into these arguments with each other. But at the end of the day, both of those people have an expectation that's not being met, and it's not by one another, right? The server is like, I'm living off of these tips, as you said, and I need these tips in order for me to survive. And when you're a cheapskate, that's how they look at patrons that don't want to tip or don't want to tip to the level that they feel is appropriate.
Yeah.
Then I'm not able to survive. People that are going out, because the server is a patron as well. And oftentimes when they're a patron, they probably feel, some type of empathy for the individual that's serving them, because they know, hey, you living off of these tips. And but the regular patron that's going out, they're like, well, I'm getting paid at my job. I'm going out, I'm spending money, and they're expecting the service that's being rendered to be appropriate. Now, every situation, there are some that are just, scumbags. They don't like to tip anybody and they don't want to give anybody any money.
Yeah.
But for the most part, people are wanting to tip on the service that's being rendered to them. And I think that sometimes we're not giving patrons the ability to do that, right? The whole point of tipping someone is to say your service that you get paid to do, you did a really great job, and I think I should give you a tip for that. And then now we're taking that away. We're stripping that away from the patron. And the patron is like, well, you're telling me that just to come to this establishment, I need to give you 20%. I can't even have an expectation of how this should go. So those two arguments, though valid, to
Yeah.
me, they're just still not addressing why is it that the people that are owning these companies are allowed to conduct themselves this way. And I feel like as long as we're bickering down here with one another about the nuance of this situation of your survival versus, my ability to give you your survival, we have to talk about the reason that we're in this position is because that owner over there wants to drive up to this restaurant or this bar or this place in a Urus. And they don't want to pay you an appropriate wage in order for, everyone to be working the way that they should be working. You know what I mean? And it be a
Absolutely.
pleasurable experience. You go to a restaurant and you want it to be a pleasurable experience. I mean, even me personally, when I go places and I have great service, oh my gosh, I love it. I even tell them, I'm like, oh my God, your service was so great. And I really want, even outside of just having to pay the 20%, but like if you really were giving that good service, I want to do that. But also I can understand that because we know that not only in the service industry are wages a problem, right? It's a national thing across the board. I also have empathy for the individual that says, hey, I want to go out. I want to spend my personal time doing something that I enjoy. And I think that there should be a certain level of expectation for them to be able to do that without severely hurting their pockets. If they do give a tip, it's like it's not enough. It shouldn't just be it's not enough. You're gonna come across people that are cheap, but some people just want to go out and patronize these businesses. And if the owner simply paid the servers and the busboys and the bartenders and everyone enough, then we wouldn't have this problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel similar to you. It can be a conflicting thing because on one hand, there was a traditional way of doing things for the longest time where it's like you would tip people for receiving what you would deem to be, like I guess like a prolonged service, like you would see like,
Right.
like in a restaurant or something like that, or like in a coffee shop, in a bar, you're tipping for, this like engagement, constant engagement with this individual serving you at whatever establishment it was. But I guess, like as time has gone on and, I've been learning more and more about, what's going on in our country, where it seems like every company that you are seeing right now is experiencing record profits again and again and again and again. And
Stock
meanwhile, you'll
buybacks.
you'll get the occasional story of like where someone's like, oh, well, this person's wage went up and this person's wage went up, but it honestly, it's not keeping up. It really
Right.
isn't. Like, these companies are making so much more money than they've ever have. I mean, if you see it right now, if you go look at these headlines, companies in the last like 3 years are having like 70-year high profits. And
Right.
meanwhile, their employees are living off of, government assistance and, people having to work 2 and 3 jobs. You have our president out there, go ahead and like congratulating himself for how many people have jobs right now. And it's like, well, yeah, you kind of need 2 or 3 to survive anymore because people aren't paying you enough.
We don't
So
talk about that enough. We don't
no, we
talk
do
about
not.
that enough.
And
Yeah.
so when I said that I was like firmly in the 26%, it's because like while I understand that people are annoyed by, having to, I guess, like where all these different like places are asking for tips anymore, I'm fully with everyone out there who is unfortunately relying on these things to survive.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to be the solution. I don't think it's not a solution. And I don't
Right.
want to like put it out there as a solution, but until we have a solution, people need to survive out there. I live in a city right now where people are being like forced out of this place because they can't keep up with the cost of housing. Like, housing prices just by itself are pushing people out of cities that they've grown up in, cities that they love,
Yeah.
places where they want to be. They can't afford to be there anymore because there are landlords who have unlimited power to raise rents as high as they want to, and nothing can stop them.
Nothing
And they can do it
happens.
at the drop of a hat, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, until we have some real kind of caps on, I think, some of these unchecked, things like our housing problems, until we have businesses who are essentially forced to pay their employees more, whether it's through government action or through collective bargaining, through unions, we do, I think, need to try to, if you can, if you can't actually afford it to people, don't put yourself in a bad financial situation because you can't do it. But if you can, people are struggling out there.
Right. And I agree. I think that if you can, you should. I feel privileged to be able to give someone a tip and not be something that is, just breaking my back. But like I said, at the same time, I just think it's completely unacceptable. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. I think it's just completely, unacceptable that we don't put the onus of this entire conversation on the owners. At the end of the day, um, we have to understand that we all play a role, but if we're not having the right conversation, then we're not going to get to the solution. If the issue is that individuals are allowed to underpay someone, because even when we talk about like labor costs, in every industry, especially unionized industries, we talk about labor costs, and I always say value your labor. Don't let people make you feel like your labor isn't valuable. Actually, it's one of the most valuable resources in a nation, is the labor of the individuals that work there. And so I just, in my opinion, I feel that we as the consumer is oftentimes subsidizing that manipulation and that misappropriation of the use of someone's labor. We're subsidizing that. And for what? And I know that a lot of these companies want the everyday American to look at this situation like we're talking about a mom and pop store, but we're not. Most of the time, we're not. We're talking about, a business. If you look at them, the restaurant if it's not a franchise, if it's not something that, we see very often, it's something that's bringing in, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, or maybe even
Millions.
millions, depending on, what level of service we're talking about. And they're still not expected to make sure that everyone in that establishment that's making that establishment be what it is paid appropriately. You know what I mean? And like I said, you can just tie it into it. tie it into the amount that someone pays. Make it invisible to the consumer, but very visible to the server, right? The server knows what they're going to get on the back end, but take it away from the front end of the situation, because at the end of the day, and then if you take it away from the front end of the situation, then what's coming in is actual gratuity, right? Because they're going to pay whatever, don't even say it's a part of gratuity. Build it into your prices if that's what you need to do. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, just take it off the table of the patron, so that the patron can just come to your establishment, have a good time, enjoy the environment, and not have to have that interaction with the server, because the server is looking, because then we have all kinds of other things that come into play, like prejudices, right? When, it's Black people come into a restaurant and they'll service them differently. I and a group of my friends, I've been serviced differently, just on the strength of maybe the perception, being told multiple times how much stuff something costs and all this stuff. To me, those things come off as prejudices, because you're like, you think that I'm not going to be able to tip or pay for what I'm getting. But at the end of the day, if that wasn't even something of a concern of the server, if that wasn't even concern at all, then we wouldn't even be having a conversation about it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And, for those who are interested in maybe like a follow-up conversation about this, send me a message on Instagram. Tell me your thoughts on how this conversation went. Do you think there's maybe some angles that we didn't touch on, or maybe some different like things that we can get into in a future conversation? I want to thank Lyn for coming on the show today and talking about this with me. I think I have a lot of polls on Instagram, so I think there's a lot more conversations like this to be had in the
Yeah.
future. So, Lyn, where can people find you at online if they want to like follow more of your content?
So currently you can find me on PoliticN Lyn on Instagram. That's just PoliticN and then Lyn at the end. Or if we're on TikTok, you can find me at the end of the day news, where I kind of focus on, not just the current events, but just, overall my political commentary on what's going on in the world.
Okay, so we'll have those links in the episode description for those who are interested. Thanks for checking out this episode, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching this video of Independent Thought. If you liked the conversation, please go ahead and give the video itself a like, and be sure to subscribe for future episodes on the channel.